Hi guys. So today I'm doing something a bit different. I've kind of touched on criminals and their behavior, and what kind of makes them tick, if you like. But in this one, I'm going to talk about something that's very controversial. Okay. I'll let you make up your own mind on it. I'm not going to say one way or the other. I'm going to be impartial. But I'm also going to use a module that I was doing in college, and I also used a lot of statistical analysis. So my course was DNA and forensic analysis. For that, we had to do law and ethics, and our lecturer for that was brilliant. Paul, I still remember him. I won't give his full name out just in case. He knows the law, so if there's anything that I say about him that he doesn't want, he'll certainly know how to steal my ass. But he was a very good lecturer, and I just felt the way he explained everything was very well put. So he was really good at just saying, look, this is the law. There's a reason for it. Due to a certain law, you may be, punished. Or he even said before, and I thought it was gas. He was like, I was pulled over before for speeding, and he looked at his speedometer and how fast he was going, and he was like, oh yeah, I was. That's perfectly fine, officer, and paid the fine. The accelerator in the car, he was just foot to the floor. He said he had to go somewhere fast and he got into trouble for it. And he was like, oh, I was. um, so yeah, he was a fellow of the law and he upheld the law. Um, and I just remember it kind of interested me, and I'm going to use a case that he gave as an example of a miscarriage of justice because I feel like we always assume that in the court of law, when someone is found guilty, that's it. They're guilty as fuck, and that's all. Lock them up and throw away the key. And I am, of course, talking about the Lucy Letby case. And this case is rotten to the core. That there's so much misinformation, statistical error, um, even a paper of supposed expert witness, Shoo Lee, Dr. Shoo Lee. He called it out and said you've misinterpreted my evidence. So basically, I'll briefly explain that because the evidence that they're saying is that the children who Lucy Letby is alleged to have killed suffered from air embolisms, meaning that air was directly inserted into their blood flow, intravenously because IV drip, that means intravenous, i.e. in the vein, okay? They sometimes I get a bit squeamish around blood, pick the great course, and I can get my blood's taken and injections. I just don't like looking when it's done, but intravenous. That's what it was, right? An IV drip is what the children were on. When you see it in a hospital, we all know. We all know. But Dr. Shoo Lee's evidence was on arterial embolisms, which are completely different. Because the crime that Lucy Letby's accused of is inserting air into the veins, not the arteries, meaning that they cannot use his paper. But they have, and they've been allowed to use his paper, the prosecution. You're thinking to yourself, well, that's not factually correct. And he's even said it's not factually correct. And yet they're saying he can't give his evidence. And it's kind of like, that's bullshit. Like that's just, I think it's pretty relevant to the case. They're saying it's not. And I'm kind of like, that is very relevant. But I'm going to just show you now some dodgy statistics as well. And it's explained a lot better. So I'll kind of pause the video, I think, and might have to do a bit of digging just to clarify exactly what they're trying to say, because statistical evidence is complicated at the best of times. I'll show you now. So I'm going to share my screen. I've got two cases. I'm going to show you. We go into this now. This is on the conversation. Okay, so put that up. Right. So an article from the conversation. Experts have challenged the medical case against Lucy Letby, and what about the statistical evidence? So I'll move myself up here. Yeah, we'll have a look. So yeah, you can read through here. An international panel of medical experts have thrust Lucy Letby back into the spotlight at a press conference convened by Letby's legal team. The experts case doubt over, the experts cast doubt over the former nurse's conviction. Letby was given 15 whole life sentences for murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 7 more. Speaking at the press conference in London, retired neonatologist, meaning that neonatal would be after the death of a baby. He would examine it. Dr. Shoo Lee told the assembled reporters, in all cases, death or injury were due to natural causes or just bad medical care. You've got a pretty good expert here whose paper has been used to convict Lucy, and yet he's coming on himself to say this is bollocks. That's not true. You're misinterpreting my data. But let's carry on. So he's just said, just to clarify, this expert whose paper the prosecution cited as means of conviction, he has come on and said himself that in all cases, death or injury were due to natural causes or just bad medical care. You heard it. Why should we take Dr. Lee's word for it? Exactly. We don't just want to take his word for it, but let's have a look. Well, in part because he is the author of a key paper on air embolisms, which I spoke about there at the start. One of the methods that Letby was accused of using to kill babies, which formed a key part of the prosecution's evidence at the trial. He also claims that the paper's findings were misinterpreted at the trial and that a newly updated version of the article would help exonerate Letby rather than convict her. He said himself further study is needed in this area, and they wouldn't listen to that. The Letby conviction has always attracted critical attention because there were no witnesses who could confirm they saw her attacking any of the babies she was convicted of murdering. Yeah, so it's all circumstantial evidence, meaning that you were there, the babies died on your watch, therefore you're guilty. And this is the method of murder that we've chosen to convict you of, i.e., injecting air into the veins of the children, causing up here air embolisms. Okay. Nor did anyone see her perform actions that could have constituted the attempted murders. So I'll read that again, sorry. The Letby conviction has always attracted critical attention because there were no witnesses who could confirm they saw her attacking any of the babies she was convicted of murdering. Nor did anyone see her perform actions that could have constituted the attempted murder of 7 others, i.e., nobody saw her going in, harassing the babies or doing anything that could have caused harm to the children. Nobody witnessed this, right? So you're kind of like, well, where is your actual evidence? It's all circumstantial. The circumstances are these children died. And what is the common denominator? Lucy Letby. Consequently, the prosecution used statistics alongside the medical evidence the expert panel has now cast doubt upon. So, how solid is the statistical evidence? Let's have a look. A key piece of statistical evidence is a chart which showed that Lucy Letby was on duty every time one of the crimes of which she was accused occurred, but that none of the other nursing staff were. On the face of it, it seems quite damning. And it does. Like, I mean, if you think to yourself, you were the one looking after these children and they all died, pretty fucking damning, right? I mean, you're there going to yourself, they all died. You've got some explaining to do. But what you would use to counter argue, or sorry, to back up your evidence, you'd say these nurses were on here and no children died. Quite suspicious if, every time you're on, kids are dying, and it's kind of like, well, yeah, that's fair enough, but that's been misrepresented. You're going to see that by this graph below, but I'll just read that. So I read all the way through. I just thought it was important to come in on that, but we'll go. A key piece of statistical evidence is a chart which showed that Lucy Letby was on duty every time one of the crimes of which she was accused of occurred, but that none of the other nursing staff were. On the face of it, it seems quite damning. But when you think about it, it's unsurprising that Letby's column is the only one that is full of crosses. Any of the events at which she was not present, she would not have been charged with, and consequently wouldn't appear in the chart. Meaning that if a child died and she wasn't on watch, they wouldn't represent that. So you can manipulate data. That's what they call it in statistics. It sounds like I'm into statistics. I kind of like statistics, but it can be very boring, very, very boring. There's a lot of different things at play, like you've got bias, you've got prosecutors' fallacy, um, which they'll go into in detail down below. I'm not even going to get into that now because we'll be here all day. But basically, what it's saying here is if deaths occurred when Lucy Letby wasn't there, that doesn't suit the prosecution. Why would they give that analysis? They wouldn't, because it shows, well, they died here, so she wasn't on watch. Therefore, you could argue maybe it's just due to poor care by the hospital, but that doesn't serve the prosecutor's best interests. So we're going to just go into this. It's a bit hard to read, I understand, so we'll have a little read through it. So you look at Lucy Letby, and these are all the cases in which she was involved in. So you have the event, you have the child related. It's called child A. They've done it alphabetically. Gone with child P twice. They've doubled up here on this. Interesting. So you can see the X's would be where someone was present in the ward at the time the child died. So Lucy Letby is obviously there the whole time, for every single one of them. But she would be, because they're the ones she's accused of killing, right? And you can see the next biggest number. Like, I mean, you've got 25 here, right? So it is quite damning. I do get that, but got people here who are present for 7. So you see these columns here. I'm not going to mention the names because they're not on trial. Got another one here. Like, it is quite damning, you would say, because she's got 25, and the highest number after that, I'm just going to double check. Yeah, it's 7. So you'd see it here down below. X indicates on duty, presence on the shift, where a suspicious event has been identified. So every X here on everyone's name, I don't know what, this was blank, but every event where a suspicious death occurred on this ward, it's been marked with an X. So then you're like, well, how did this happen under your watch and your supervision? And then you'll see the date of the shift. You can read through this yourself. Just leave it up here. And if you want to pause the video at this point just to look through the statistics, I would recommend you do that. But you can see through the date. You can see if it was a day or a night shift. It's all very well laid out, to be fair. Statistics can get quite messy. So I think they've done a good job here laying out the graphs. So I'll just leave it there for a sec. This is staff presence report, just FYI, and the exhibit number up here. And you can get all this on, if you type in Lucy Letby statistics and then you look up the conversation. So let's go out of that, and then to summarise, this just gives the description. A chart showing the shifts in suspicious activity was suspected and the nurses who were working each shift by the Cheshire Police. So that's where that is. So we go down. So I talked about prosecutors' fallacy, but this is just talking about another one. This is an example of what is known in statistics as the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. The fallacy is named for a story about a Texan cowboy who likes to head out to a barn after a few drinks for target practice. Invariably, the barn will get peppered with random bullet holes during the inebriated exercise, and purely by chance, some of the holes are clustered. So in the the same kind of area, so they could be all over the shots, like yeah, bang, 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 going everywhere. Like some cowboy coming in, his drug, his aim isn't going to be very good because he's buckled, he's inebriated, and the shots are going to go all over the place. One morning, the savvy sharpshooter gets out his paint cans and daubs a target around his cluster hole. So puts the target, in between the cluster of holes to give the impression of accuracy to anyone who didn't see the process by which they were made, and to draw attention away from the other more dispersed bullet holes. So he wants to make it look like his aim is more accurate than it is, essentially. The sharpshooter fallacy occurs when a conclusion is drawn based only on data consistent with given hypotheses, ignoring data that doesn't support the proposed conclusion. So you've got a given hypothesis, and basically, I know this is quite confusing, so I'll just summarize. Um, it doesn't serve the prosecutor to say, "Oh, but deaths happened when Lucy Letby wasn't present." So that chart that we just saw there is showing all the deaths she was present for, and then obviously other staff that were also present on that ward. Um, and these babies were prenatal and were also vulnerable children. They already had existing conditions. They were quite sick to begin with, and the care was inadequate. Right. So just want to touch on that. But we'll also go into, because they do summarize pretty well, to be fair. So relating the sharpshooter fallacy, there's what I was talking about earlier. There we are. But yeah, so read through the sharpshooter fallacy. The sharpshooter fallacy occurs when a conclusion is drawn based only on data consistent with the given hypothesis, ignoring data that doesn't support the proposed conclusion. Imagine, for example, you made a chart similar to the one used to convict Letby, this time including only those deaths at which a different member of the nursing staff was present. It's entirely possible, for example, if there were only if there were present sorry, I read that again. It's entirely possible, for example, if they were present for deaths at which Letby was not, that their name would be above the only column full of crosses and not Letby's. Basically meaning you could take somebody else, you know. So like let's even go back to the chart and just give a random example. Um so we look at someone with seven. So the person here, Mary Griffith, she was present for seven suspicious deaths, right? So you could just take her name and you could put it and superimpose it. So basically meaning it would just show seven here. It wouldn't show 25 columns, and that would say she was present for all of these. And there are only one, two, three, four others with, seven suspicious deaths. The person beside her, actually, Melanie Taylor as well. Basically, what you would say there is, um, you were present for all of these deaths, and you could use that to back up the fact that, oh yeah, what happened here. It's very damning. If you weren't there, the babies wouldn't have died. Essentially, you know what I mean. Um, so it takes away the argument that there was natural causes or poor healthcare, which would be negligence on the hospital's part. That's just to briefly summarize. But we go back down. Sorry, I'm after skipping ahead. We go back up. Hmm. Yeah, so if Lucy Letby was not present for certain deaths, then that would kind of debunk the whole argument of the prosecution, because deaths occurred and she wasn't there. So if your argument is every time there was a death in this hospital on this particular ward, what was the common denominator? Lucy Letby. But if there's deaths and there's quite a few of them when she's not present, that throws your whole argument out the window. To summarize, I hope I've done a good job explaining that in layman's terms. Just let me know if I, because there's a lot going on. And as we get to it here, indeed, it later transpired that the table did not include six other deaths that occurred during the same period and with which Letby was not charged, meaning she wasn't there and six deaths occurred. Right, so what the fuck happened there? Six deaths occurred, Lucy wasn't there, so what happened? That's quite significant, I would say, given that the highest number for everyone else was seven. Six other deaths occurred. Who else was present for them? So we're only seeing people's names on the shift that Lucy Letby was on, right? Were they present for the other ones as well? Maybe they were. Maybe those people who have seven X's next to their name were present for another six, meaning that they're there for 13. And I would say 13 is pretty suspicious if you're going off what the prosecution is saying. But anyway, um, yeah, indeed, it later transpired that the table did not include six other deaths that occurred during the same period and with which Letby was not charged. The jury was not told about these other deaths because, as I say, it's not in the prosecution's best interest to tell them about these. It's quite damning, it looks very suspicious, I must say. As Jane Hutton, a professor of medical statistics at the University of Warwick, argues, if you want to find out what went wrong, you need to consider all deaths, not just a subset of them. Absolutely right. She also points out that it's important to consider how likely the other alternative causes of death were at the struggling Countess of Chester neonatal unit. So it was, it wasn't doing very well. There'd been complaints made about the standard of care quite regularly. It was doing quite poorly. There was talks of even shutting it down, I believe. We're going to go into a few of these highlighted pieces here, but it was reported for poor standard of care. And I remember reading up on it, and I couldn't for the life of me find the article. I'm hoping that they'll mention it on that highlighted section, but it said that the consultant doctor, basically the doctor that you consult, talk to and say, look, this shit is not going very well. The standard of care is very poor. I'm concerned about these children. There's a bacterial outbreak, which there actually was in the hospital, unsanitary water, I believe, as well. Um, the consultant doctor is there basically to run the hospital and the ward. Well, on the ward more so, if there's any problems and the nurse is incapable of dealing with them, they consult the consultant and the consultant takes further action. They're supposed to do rounds in the ward twice a day. Apparently, they were only doing it twice a week, which means, oh my God, shit's going down here. Get me the consultant. He's not here. He or she is not here. So the nurses have admitted we're not capable of dealing with this. We need the consultant doctor. Where is he? He's not here. Why isn't he here? Because the NHS apparently isn't as wonderful as everybody makes out, and it's been brought to its knees. Lots of people say, it was wonderful, and now it's starting to emerge. There's a lot of shit going on that is not wonderful, and it's been highlighted here. Um, People don't want to believe that their children, their vulnerable children, are getting inadequate care in a hospital because then there's a much more sinister plot, beneath the surface. But anyway, we're going on to the prosecutor's fallacy here. The probability of so many deaths on a neonatal unit in such a short period should be quite low. It should be, yeah, doesn't mean it is. At first glance, this might seem to make the alternative explanation of murder seem more likely. But this is a classic statistical error. So, a lot of deaths have occurred. Why is this? This is a hospital. Of course, the best standard of care is being given, right, because it's vulnerable children. Not necessarily. And we're all more inclined to go, naturally, somebody must be murdering them. We want to pin the blame on someone, and we don't want a massive organization like a prenatal baby ward. Don't want that to be coming under extreme criticism because we'd like to believe doctors and nurses are giving the best care possible to our vulnerable children. But sadly, that's not always the case, unfortunately. So it's a classic statistical error. The mistake is so common in courtrooms that it is known as the prosecutor's fallacy. Just remember that it's so common, right? That's why there's a name for it, because it is very common. The argument starts by showing that if the suspect is innocent, seeing a particular piece of evidence is extremely unlikely. So basically, the air embolisms. So if Lucy Letby was innocent, we shouldn't see them. Just to give you an example, right? So basically, what they'll argue is it's very unlikely for these air embolisms to have occurred had Lucy Letby not done it intentionally, meaning she's guilty of murder because air embolisms are present. Therefore, she's guilty. So, you know, if she's innocent, we wouldn't see the air embolism essentially. I hope that makes sense. But we'll see it now. So we'll say it again. The argument starts by showing that if the suspect is innocent, seeing a particular piece of evidence is extremely unlikely. For Letby, this is the assertion or assertion. I thought it would have been assertion. Oh no. This is the assertion, so we're dead certain on this, that if so the assertion that if she was innocent of killing these babies, the probability of them dying due to other causes is extremely low. The prosecutor then deduces incorrectly that an alternative explanation, the suspect's guilt, is extremely likely. Okay, so if it wasn't the air embolism administered by Lucy Letby, what was it? You know, and the alternative explanation for the child dying is extremely unlikely, is what they're saying, but that's not true. So they're saying, you know, okay, if it's not the air embolism, then what is it? But that's not likely, so she must have done it, which isn't true at all. Which means a further investigation needs to be done, but that's not what they're saying. So we go further on. The argument neglects to take into account any other possible alternative explanations in which the suspect is innocent, such as the death of these babies due to inadequate care. We don't want to take that into account, but we have to. That's not what's happening here. It also neglects the possibility that the explanation that the prosecution is proposing, in which the suspect is guilty, may just be as uncommon as the alternative explanations, if not more so. So, what it's saying there is perhaps the inadequate care is more likely to have occurred than Lucy Letby injecting air into the baby's veins, you know? So, it actually might be quite more, the probability of poor healthcare may be a lot more common and a lot more likely than her actually murdering the children. And yet they've just chosen to completely blank that out, you know. No, 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 that's poppycock, poppycock. You can just picture them in the like in the House of Commons, you know, with their fucking the judge's wig and all. They're basically suiting their narrative by going, no, 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 air embolisms are the cause of death, the only cause of death. That's it, you know. But you fail to take into account that these children are not perfectly healthy. A lot of them, I believe, suffered with pneumonia, so they're struggling to breathe as it is. You know, they're not getting enough oxygen into their blood. Very likely that an air embolism can occur in that situation. I'm using lots of technical language and it's tripping me up, but you know what I mean. I hope. So the argument neglects to take into account any other possible alternative explanations in which the suspect is innocent, such as the death of these babies due to inadequate care. It also neglects the possibility that the explanation that the prosecution is proposing, in which the suspect is guilty, may just be as uncommon as the alternative explanations, if not more so. By just presenting the low probability of these 7 babies dying naturally, the inference that an untrained jury is invited to draw runs something along these lines. So basically, this is what the prosecution wants the jury to believe. Okay, they're trying to basically sell this idea, the inference, you know, what you infer, what you believe. So what they're trying to get them to believe is the deaths of these babies from natural causes is extremely rare, but maybe it's not. So the odds that the deaths of these babies from natural causes is extremely rare. So the odds that the deaths are the result of murder is correspondingly extremely high. So basically, like, you know, weigh it out, and basically you're going, if one probability is higher, naturally the other one is lower, and vice versa. So you think to yourself, on one hand, we'll use this hand, um, the argument proposed by the defence is that the babies died of natural causes. Okay, well, the probability of that happening is low versus prosecutors' argument. Lucy Letby killed them, extremely high. What do you infer from that, you know? So basically saying, well, if they didn't die of natural causes, Lucy Letby murdered them because the likelihood of them dying from natural causes is extremely low, whereas it might not be. you know. Um, it's like, well, if we take away one probability, we have to say, well, the other is very, very likely. You can't say in all certainty, but you can say it's very, very likely. And if it's likely, and the alternative explanation isn't, what does the jury find? They find that she's guilty, you know? And as it goes on here, however, it must also be taken into account when weighing up the evidence that multiple infant murders are also extremely uncommon. So it's not very common that loads of children are murdered. So therefore, you're saying that it's very likely that Lucy Letby murdered them because it's very unlikely that the children died of natural causes due to inadequate health care. You're saying it's very rare that children die of inadequate health care, which may be true, but it's also very rare that someone would murder a bunch of prenatal children who are vulnerable. It's very rare that people murder children in general, to be honest. So it's kind of bullshit, It's complete bullshit if that's your argument. Because the argument they seem to be making is, it's likely that people will murder children, but it's very unlikely of a child dying of natural causes. I would say it's more likely of a child dying of natural causes than someone murdering them, wouldn't you? Just saying. So, however, it must also be taken into account when weighing up the evidence that multiple infant murders are also extremely uncommon. What really matters is the relative likelihoods of the different explanations. Weighing these very unusual events against each other is not an easy thing to do. Exactly, so it's both of these events are quite uncommon, and yet you're weighing them up. Like I said, it's like a scale. Lucy Letby did it. They died of natural causes. You're kind of trying to make an argument, you know what I mean? And if one didn't occur, the other has to have occurred. And you're kind of prompting the jury to pick one or the other. It's like a fucking lucky dip. Problem is, you're dealing with somebody's life here, and she's been painted in a very bad light, a child murderer. So it's quite damning, you know. And if she is innocent, this is a massive miscarriage of justice. So here we are now. Criminal cases review. Other statistical issues with the case also deserve more attention. The higher number of deaths at the Countess of Chester, even excluding the babies that Letby has been convicted of murdering, or the possibility of false positive medical identifications of murder, for example. Whether Letby's team's appeal to the Criminal Cases Review Commission will be successful or not remains to be seen. The statistical issues over the case, when taken alongside the doubts about the medical evidence, mean that there is certainly a possibility. So basically saying that there is a high number of deaths at the Countess of Chester where Lucy Letby worked, the ward where she worked. So it's not as if babies weren't dying. There was a lot of deaths. These are vulnerable kids, as I say, so they're dying. And this hospital clearly provides poor care and has been under investigation. But we're going to check that out in a second. But it's not like you assume the hospital is perfect. That's what we're kind of being led to believe. We're being led to believe that you've got a pristine ward with a consultant going and doing the rounds twice a day, which we know they weren't. There was poor sanitary conditions, so there's a lot going on here, and that's quite damning. I think it certainly warrants a looking into and a retrial, perhaps. You know. So it says, throughout all this, it's important to remember the families affected by the events at the Countess of Chester Hospital. Whatever the ultimate truth of the matter, this ongoing case will undoubtedly make dealing with their grief more difficult. Yeah, 100%. Like, I mean, poor families like dealing with this, and that's the thing. It's probably dragging it all up for them again. But at the same time, if Lucy Letby didn't do this, she should not go to prison for it. And I'm not saying she did or didn't, but the evidence given certainly doesn't hold up very well to scrutiny. And I'm going to go into a few of these highlighted bits here for you. So the key paper on air embolisms, we're definitely going to check that out. So let's have a look here. I was looking this up before. So this is Shoo Lee, Dr. Shoo Lee's work. We're going to have a look here. Yeah, so I believe this is the one. Pulmonary vascular air embolisms. Um, this doesn't look like the right one here. I've been into this one already, but I don't see his name after that work, so I think this is his one. I see Lee SK. We'll have a look into this one now. Right, this looks like the one. No abstract available. That's weird. Let's type in his name, shall we? Have a look there. Take a look at his work. And have a look at pulmonary. Wrong spelling. Pulmonary. Just the one. I can't believe there's no abstract available. That's just maybe he's had the paper pulled because there's new findings. But we'll have a look at this one: systemic air embolism in the respiratory distress syndrome of the newborn. So let's have a look here. So there's technical language here. I'll try my best to explain if I can. Okay. Details of 25 cases of neonatal systemic air embolism, including three of our patients, are reviewed. This rare complication of respiratory distress syndrome, RDS, not the RDS in Ballsbridge, the RDS was observed in 21 premature infants. So basically, respiratory distress syndrome was observed in 21 out of 25 children. And four um, full term newborns. So we're talking about prenatal and, babies that made it to term, full term. Four full term newborns, of whom 23 required intermittent positive pressure ventilation, IPBF, IPBF, IPPV. 21 of these patients' air embolism was preceded by pulmonary interstitial emphysema. Right, so emphysema is like a buildup of mucus in the lungs, pulmonary meaning the lungs. So there's a buildup of mucus in the lungs. Then you have pneumomediastinum, pneumothorax, and or pneumopericardium. Cardium being, of course, the heart. So basically, air going to the heart from the lungs. That's what you'd be talking about there. Thorax, I've been stabbed in my thorax, right through the torso, in the torso. Um, Air embolism occurred between 3 and 288 hours after delivery. Okay. The outcome was lethal in 24 cases. Only one patient survived. Two main pathogenic mechanisms are discussed: entrance of air from ruptured alveoli into the lung capillaries and introduction of air catheters in umbilical vessels. Think about it, think about it. We got there. Basically, what it's saying is these are natural causes. You know what I mean? So just reading back over it, these are very vulnerable children. So the respiratory distress syndrome, the RDS, meaning that they can't breathe properly, right? Meaning that there's not enough air getting from the lungs to the heart, and vice versa. There's not enough air in the blood, or the air might get stuck in the blood, causing ruptured blood vessels, etc. Just to, summarize. But it's taken 4 full-term babies, and then the rest of them are all in distress, from pre-existing conditions. So the full-term children, they're all suffering, um, and obviously only 2 babies didn't need the positive pressure ventilation, the PPV. It's hard to say for some reason. I'm trying to go for PPF. And when it says here air embolism was preceded, that means there was a condition there before the air embolism occurred, right? So basically, what this means is there is a condition there before the embolism, which would give rise to the argument that in Lucy Letby's case, there was a shit ton of issues going on before the air embolism occurred. So right, so looking at that, you can say it. And only 1 patient survived. So in all likelihood, using this study, which was not Shoo Lee's work, it's actually another one. Because I think they found that there were problems with the research, and he admitted it himself. So perhaps it's been pulled for that reason, and there's no abstract available. But you look at ruptured alveoli, the little pockets that hold the air in the lungs. If you ever remember your secondary school biology, the little pockets that hold the air. You've got the bronchus, the bronchioles, which are like the little branches, and then the alveoli are like the little pockets holding the air. And might actually get we'll just get maybe a documentary, a document to show you in a second. So in air via catheters, right? So that would have been through medical intervention. It led to the ruptured alveoli into the lung capillaries. So when foreign air was introduced to try and save the kids, it ruptured the alveoli into the lungs, thus causing, sudden death from the intervention. But they were trying to do what they could to save the child. It wasn't as if they were intentionally murdering the kids. That's what they're saying here. We introduced air because the child wasn't breathing properly, and it killed them as a result, but they were going to probably die in all likelihood anyway, so we had to. Does that make sense? So Lucy Letby might not have been trained properly, and there were accusations that the staff weren't trained properly, which isn't their fault. They're supposed to be given the correct training, and if they weren't, they might have done what they thought was best, and it didn't work. That's up to the hospital to provide them with that training. Critical attention, we have a look there. That might just be a BBC article and nothing else really. Yeah, no, that's not really of any use to us. We'll have a look through now. The chart we see there, so we don't need to go into that. So let's have a look now, actually, the other deaths, see if we can find anything about that. So the verdict handed down to former neonatal nurse Lucy Letby last week brought to an end more than 21 months of court proceedings. After 2 trials and 2 attempts to appeal, Letby has been convicted of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 7 others. She is serving whole life sentences. So remember, we saw 25 deaths that looked suspicious. They pinned 7 actual murders and 7 attempted murders. For many, there has been little room for doubt that Letby is the worst child serial killer in British history. I thought she was a monster. I just want to say that now. I was led to believe she was an absolute monster, like what an evil cow. You know, how could she do something like that? Now I'm not so sure, I have to say. Jurors heard harrowing testimony from the parents of the babies who died and were shown notes scrawled by Letby and shift rotas that were used to condemn her. Basically, she wanted to be a mother, and I don't think she could have children, or she didn't have a boyfriend, and she was upset about that. They used that, like she said, "Oh, what have I done? I've killed these kids." She said that, but I just think to myself, yeah, it looks pretty damning. But imagine if you're an empathetic human being and you try to save kids and you can't save them, and you work in this ward and they die on your watch, you're gonna feel guilty, aren't you? You're gonna feel like, oh my God, I could have saved them and I didn't. I fucked up so badly here. You're gonna feel guilt. I mean, I know I would. I think, oh my God, I should have done more. What could I have done to save them? They're after dying under my watch. I'd feel guilty. So that's pretty reasonable. I'd feel like shit. I don't think I'd ever be able to live that down, even if I tried my damnedest to save them. You'd always think there was more you could have done, I believe. But throughout the trial period and much of the preceding 6 years, when Cheshire police were investigating a cluster of baby deaths at the Countess of Chester COC hospital and had arrested Letby, laws intended to ensure juries are not influenced by stories in the press meant British journalists reported only what was said in court, which is good, you know, so that stops bias. Um, because if someone comes out and goes, "Oh, evil killer" or whatever, people, well, in fairness, we were all influenced and told that she was evil, and so I don't know if that exactly worked. But outside court, however, there has been a growing chorus of voices raising questions about some of the key evidence presented in the trial. There was no forensic evidence to prove her guilt, and no one saw Letby, who continues to maintain her innocence, causing harm. That also applied to the retrial that reached a guilty verdict last week. Although one of the doctors concluded that she must have tampered with the breathing tube of a baby on 3 occasions, he did not actually see her doing it. He can't say that because he hasn't seen her do it. Oh, she must have done it. How do you know? You don't know. You haven't seen her do it. It's all circumstantial. Maybe he didn't insert it correctly. I certainly know enough doctors are arrogant to you like to think they do no harm, and it says do no harm. But there's certainly enough motivation for them to lie and throw her under the bus here. Because if it's found that they were negligent, they'll be struck off and lose their job. This article, by the way, is from July 9th, 2024, last year. So it's nearly a year old. Just in case you're wondering, it says convicted a week ago or last week. Yeah, it's not talking about a week ago from today. I'm sure you probably already knew that. Yeah, like that's he shouldn't be allowed to come out and say that she must have tampered with the breathing tube of a baby on 3 occasions. Yet you've never seen her do it once. You can't definitively say that because you haven't seen it. And had they been doing the rounds like they were supposed to, they could have checked on that, which I'm sure they would have done had they gone in. But because they weren't going and doing the rounds, everything could have been running terribly, and they weren't checking up on it, which is negligence on their part. And the hospital should be held very responsible for that, and it was looking pretty damning for them. The prosecution's case instead drew on accounts from doctors and nurses in the hospital's neonatal unit and relied heavily on statistical evidence, as we've just seen, and expert opinion on complex medical points, some of which took days to explain to the lay jury. Lay is where you get layman from, the layman. So when people say layman, I remember having this conversation with my brother, and he was like, "Who was layman?" It's not a person specifically; it's the layman. You know, so we're non-biased. So that's why you'll never get a lawyer um, called as an expert, or sorry, called to a jury because he's an expert. So he's biased. You know what I mean? or if there's a medical case, you'll never have a doctor called as a member of the jury. They have to be impartial, impartial, meaning that they're not swayed one way or the other. You know what I mean? Okay. It is these opinions that some clinicians claim do not stand up to scrutiny, and I would definitely agree with that. The case was high profile and emotionally charged. Naturally, babies are dying. You're going to be extremely emotional, and people will prey on that to get you to say guilty. Like if babies have died and you say this woman murdered them, my natural instinct, sadly, and I think a lot of us are the same, is oh my God, that evil bitch. How could she do? Wouldn't you agree? We'd all be likely to go, that's an evil bitch. How could she do that? And if we don't look at the evidence and scrutinize the evidence, we're all going to just believe this is her, she did it, she's guilty, worst child killer in history, lock her up and throw away the key. So, successive juries and the families of the babies who died are convinced Letby was responsible. But the families of the babies are extremely emotionally charged and very vulnerable to manipulation. Not their fault, of course it'd be. But if someone gives them a face, that's what you're looking for, aren't you? You know, you don't want to believe that a hospital is not looking after your children adequately, but it's harder to believe, isn't it? Like it's harder to get your head around that an entire hospital is not looking after children, is not doing its job, because then you have to admit that there's a lot of other babies not being taken care of properly. And we'd rather go, no, the hospital is great. This woman did it. You know what I mean? So it's definitely easier to blame someone than an entire organization. While few of the experts the Guardian spoke to went as far as to say they believed Letby was innocent, the questions about the evidence called into doubt, they said, the safety of the convictions. A Guardian investigation has interviewed dozens of these experts and seen further evidence from emails and documents. Those raising concerns include several leading consultant neonatologists, such as Dr. Shoo Lee, some with current or recent leadership roles, and several senior neonatal nurses. Others are public health officials, sorry, others are public health professionals, GPs, biochemists, a leading government microbiologist, and lawyers. Several of those still working in the NHS have asked to remain anonymous, fearing the impact if they are named. Of course, if they're seen to be whistleblowers, no one will hire them, and their reputation could be tarnished. There's a lot of powerful people here who don't want their hospitals shut, and they don't want people believing that they aren't doing their best job. You know, they fucked up. The hospital has been run inadequately, and they knew about it. Imagine how bad that'd look. They were warned. They were told it wasn't being done correctly. Concerns were raised, and yet they chose to do nothing about it. It's quite damning, isn't it? And it wouldn't be the first time like very powerful people threw someone under the bus to cover their own arses. Just saying. These experts said that they were acutely aware of the suffering of the families involved and did not want to reopen their trauma, but were so troubled they felt compelled to become involved. So, like, you don't want to re traumatize the family, of course you don't. And yet, still, they felt like they had to, they simply had to, because this might be an innocent woman going to prison. So, I must say something. I know it might traumatize the families again, and I don't want to do that, but I simply can't let an innocent woman go to prison for a crime she didn't commit. Pretty reasonable, I would say. And if the fact that they've chosen, like they said, it's going to traumatize the families, or it could do, but I have to. Doesn't that tell you they really believe that she's innocent? Prominent statisticians have described as fallacious a shift table shown. Prominent statisticians have described as fallacious a shift table shown to the jury implicating Letby because she was the one constant presence when babies died or collapsed. That was a hard one to say. I don't know if that's anyway. The Guardian also conducted interviews after several hours with the lead prosecution witness, Dr. Dewi Evans. Dewi's a Welsh name, and the specialist instructed for the defence, the neonatologist Dr. Mike Hall. I've heard of Dewi Evans, and he seems like quite a dodgy character. You know, he just seemed to go, "She's guilty." That's it, without asking any questions. Um, it seemed very much a case of he was motivated to say it, right? There was a case before, actually. I might go into it if it doesn't take too long, but where he was found to have just basically gone, somebody else is guilty, and it wasn't, it wasn't very factually correct, but he was adamant he was getting a conviction because if he's proven wrong, then he looks like an idiot, doesn't he? So he wants to go, no, she's guilty. He is definitely hell bent on getting convictions. It's in his nature. He's proven it before. So there's a bias there, and there has to be no bias. Where Dr. Shoo Lee has gone, you've misinterpreted my work and been very good and honest about it. Dewi Evans seems the opposite. He seems prone to getting convictions. He brags about it. I got convictions and I helped the prosecution. So there's an obvious bias, but they've chosen to ignore that. Is that Welsh? Ambulance. It looks like a dyslexic person spelling out it. Ambulance and ambulance. All right. So I thought I saw a different Welsh spelling for ambulance. I don't know. Cheshire would be quite close to Wales. So in 2013, 2014, the COC neonatal unit had 4 deaths each year, which isn't great. No deaths, that's ideal, isn't it? But four. Then between June 2015 and June 2016, an unusual cluster of 13 deaths occurred. So they have 4 deaths each year. So it's not as if they're doing too hot to begin with. That's the Countess of Cheshire neonatal unit. The hospital has given different accounts of the number of dates of the death. Sorry, the hospital has given different accounts of the numbers and dates of the deaths on different occasions, stating 15 deaths in an earlier response to a Freedom of Information request. So that's freedom of information. They have to give it whether they want to or not. The hospital, worried by the deaths, commissioned a review from the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, RCPCH, RCP today, RASPECT today, in July 2016. It found the unit was very short of nursing staff and that consultants were spread too thinly between the paediatric ward and the neonatal unit. Like I said, so there's not enough nursing staff, which, I mean, you might say if you're working in a shop like Tesco or something, not having enough staff isn't that big an issue, but you're dealing with vulnerable people in a hospital. So, of course, it's a very important issue. You need adequate healthcare. And the consultants are going, to and from different areas. They're not spending enough time looking at one. They're overstretched, overstretched, under resourced, and not giving adequate healthcare to anybody. How many times now, like, do you hear we're on a waiting list, or we haven't got the resources, we haven't got the funds, we haven't because they don't pay their staff enough. Then they get foreign people in who will take less of a wage. They get a better qualification, right? So it doesn't really work out for anyone. People like in Ireland, like for example, I know the UK aren't far off, they're quite similar, but junior doctors and nurses get paid fuck all, terrible wages, are expected to do unpaid work, are overworked, they're exhausted. They do night shifts, they're absolutely exhausted, and they're not appreciated here, so they go abroad. And then we're like, oh shit, they're all leaving, so we have to get other people in. The HSE, obviously, as it is in Ireland, and the NHS in the UK, but it's not good. It really isn't, because no one is benefiting from this except for the fuckers in the high chairs, making a fortune. But they're not getting in staff and paying them enough. They're not giving them enough incentive to stay, and there's not enough people doing it as a result. So it doesn't work out well for anyone. Junior staff did not feel that they could call in consultants, often leaving the unit in the care of mid-grade doctors, many of whom lacked sufficient experience, the review reported. That's not a good situation. So they're not capable of dealing with the situation if it does occur. And that's not their fault. Mid-grade doctors who don't have the experience, they should not be consulting on cases like this because they're not trained, which is not good enough. It's simply not good enough. And the junior staff don't want to be bothering the consultants because they're overworked and probably very snappy. Oh, I can't fucking do this. I mean, I need to go over there, stop wasting my time. And you're going to be nervous. When you're starting a job, you're like, oh, sorry, could you come over, please? And then it's like, no, fuck off, I have to do this. You're like, oh, okay, well, I'll deal with it myself then. So you've got lots of anxious people who are overworked, undertrained, understaffed as well. And you've got vulnerable children. It seems like a recipe for disaster. And you've got a very poorly run ward as a result. There's definitely enough reason to suspect the hospital. Doctors were surprised by babies collapsing when they did not expect to die. Sorry, doctors were surprised by babies collapsing when they did not expect and dying when they could not explain why. Some of the most senior consultants began suspecting that Letby, who was present when these events happened, was responsible. After further deaths in late June 2016, Letby was removed from the neonatal duty. Around the same time, the hospital management downgraded the unit so that it stopped taking in the most premature babies with the highest risk of mortality. So there were more vulnerable children when she was on, and then they stopped having as many vulnerable children. Oh my God. And here we have another bias introduced. Okay, so we're gonna look through that again. So doctors were surprised by babies collapsing when they did not expect and dying when they could not explain why. Some of the most senior consultants began suspecting that Letby, who was present when these events happened, was responsible. After further deaths in late June 2016, Letby was removed from neonatal duty, and around the same time, the hospital management downgraded the unit so that it stopped taking the most premature babies with the highest risk of mortality. The number of deaths fell thereafter. Fearing that Letby would be allowed to return to the unit, consultants went to the Cheshire Police in April 2017 and triggered what would become the largest British child murder investigation of modern times. So you've got two things here, right? Again, we go to prosecutor's fallacy. So you could say when Letby was on, there was more deaths of children. When she wasn't on, there was less. The number of deaths dropped. Imagine how easy that is if you're a prosecutor. You could say, well, she was here, more deaths occurred. She's not here, less deaths are occurring. She's the common denominator again, you see? But they also downgraded the unit, which could be conveniently left out. So you see that right here? The most premature with the highest risk of mortality. You stop taking in babies with a very high risk of mortality, naturally the number of deaths will fall. They fail to mention that, don't they? They definitely do. So this is a letter from her. Let's see if we can get it better. Okay, here we are now. Good stuff. There are no words. I can't breathe. I can't focus every day for that overwhelming fear. She's saying I might kill myself right now. Um, I'll never have no, I'll never have children or hope. It's very badly worded, isn't it? But obviously she's in a traumatized state, so let's have a look through it and see if we can read it. I've got quite awkward handwriting, so I'll never have children or hope. I haven't done, or so I have done everything wrong. It's very hard to read. Never know what slander, discrimination, interpretation, all getting too much, everything, hate myself, despair, taking over my life, every so much I feel alone, scared what this has done to the future. Hate, we know that anyway. Panic, fear, lost. Why me? I am evil. I did this. I don't deserve to live. I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough. And yeah, so you see, you can see that there. Now, was it fabricated? I don't know. It looks quite scattered and it's hard to read in a lot of parts, but she did say I killed him on purpose, so that's quite damning, but we don't know what was going through her mind and her mental state at the time. She's maintained her innocence, so why would she do that? If she was admitting guilt, she'd go, right, I'm guilty, send me away. And then we have the chart again. Sketch. Anything else? Oh, yeah. Like I was using the scales and lamps. Okay, that's that then. So you can actually make out that she said, I am evil. I did this. I killed them on purpose because I am not good enough, which the prosecution relied upon as amounting to a confession. She has never formally made one. Like anyone could have written that, like technically speaking. They could say that's your handwriting, they can get an expert in, but um, she's clearly not of sound mind, though. The notes also included the words kill myself right now, hate my life, fear, panic, despair, why me? I haven't done anything wrong, suggesting a state of extreme distress. You would, like, if you're an empathetic woman, you'd be blaming yourself. I killed him. I did it on purpose. A bit weird to say that, but you might be thinking we don't know. It's hard to rationalize an irrational mind at the time, you know. Right, so just to get back, just took a little breather there. But it says it here, so it goes, I am evil, I did this, I killed him on purpose, I am not good enough. That can mean I'm not good enough at my job. And if she wasn't trained properly, that's not her fault. And we've established that the hospital was overstaffed. Oh, for fucking hell. The hospital was understaffed, overstretched, under resourced. There were lack of trained consultants. And Jesus, the senior consultants seemed pretty fucking quick to throw her under the bus, didn't they? Like it is pretty damning when you just read that, but also look at the other parts where it goes, she's never formally made an actual confession, so if she said, I did this, yes, I am guilty, then wanted to retract it, you could go, oh yeah, fair enough. The best argument you could probably make is, well, she probably wasn't of sound mind, but if she's admitted to it already, you're kind of like not really good enough now. Why'd you admit to it before? And now you're saying that you're innocent. But in person, she has never confessed once. Scribbled up bits of paper after you're obviously traumatized because she wants to take her own life, hates herself, fear, panic, despair. Why me? I haven't done anything wrong, you know, suggesting a state of extreme distress. Absolutely. And here it goes. There was no apparent motive and no psychological background that matched the serial killer. Like, if you are a serial killer and you have the mindset of one, like I imagine, and I'm just saying, I'm not an expert, I'm just going to go, what's the common thing when you think of a serial killer? Blank, emotionless, no empathy. She's clearly got empathy. You can see she's very upset by what's happened, you know. And also, serial killers are calculated. They would remove any evidence. A lot of them are very calculated, you know. And if they're not calculated, they're very obvious. If you're thinking of rage, then they're just going to kill them without good planning. That doesn't seem to be present in either case. It seems like she's clearly guilty. She feels guilty about what she's done. I'm not saying she's guilty of murdering the kids. I'm saying she feels like she didn't care for them the way she should have done. As a result, they died. What nurse with any sort of empathy isn't going to feel the same way? I put it to you, my lord. But if I was a nurse and I was caring for extremely sick babies and I found out that some of them died on my watch, I would feel very upset and think it's my fault because I didn't give them proper care. Maybe I voiced concerns, or maybe I thought, oh, the staff, the doctors are overrun. I can't go to them. You didn't go to them. And as a result, the children died. But that's not your fault because there should be a consultant there if you need them 24/7. Not the same one necessarily. That's why you have shift work in hospitals because a different consultant can come in, do the night shift. Day shift is done by another consultant in an ideal situation, but this was far from ideal. So she clearly shows remorse because the children did die under her watch, but that doesn't mean she intentionally killed them, and that's what she's being charged with. You know, like it's a neonatal ward, children die in it all the time, and a lot more than they should have done, due to inadequate care. But here we are. So it is proven there was no motive and no psychological background that matched that of a serial killer. Over many weeks through the last year's trial, doctors and nurses involved in the care of the babies explained reams of clinical notes made at the time. Underpinning the circumstantial evidence were complicated medical opinions presented in court by 6 expert witnesses. 2 others made written statements on specific points. It is this medical evidence that is at the heart of the concerns voiced to the Guardian, aspects of which have been said to be implausible or medically inaccurate. There you go. Those who spoke to the Guardian did not do so lightly. Many babies died or collapsed. Families have suffered for years. Several people who voiced their concerns also recognised that they did not sit through the proceedings and did not have access to the extensive case notes used by the expert witnesses. Fuck me. Very badly worded, isn't it? Like, never find that, a lot of spelling errors, a lot of sentences that don't quite make sense, or I don't know, might just be me. Okay. Several people who voiced their concerns also recognised that they did not sit through the proceedings and did not have access to the extensive case notes used by the expert witnesses, though during the trial, detailed accounts of the medical histories of each baby emerged. Right, so the history. They were also aware that several of their questions about evidence had been raised by Letby's defence in her trial and as core elements of her applications to appeal. Last week, the appeal court, the second highest in the land, published a detailed account of why 3 judges had strongly rejected all of them, and yet many continued to be sceptical. Hall is one of those. He provided expert opinion for the defence. Mike Hall, we were looking at earlier. He saw the COC, Countess of Cheshire, case notes, wrote a detailed report, and was at the trial every day, bar a couple of half days. His opinion was not heard by the jury, as he was not called to give testimony. He does not know why. So he was going to argue on her behalf. He wasn't called, yet Dewi Evans was. So, like, why was he not called? Why was Shoo Lee not brought in? A lot. There's a lot of very dodgy things going on here. It's like they thought she's guilty. Now make sure you get a conviction. That's what it feels like. Michael told the Guardian that he was too deeply troubled by the case with regard to medical evidence. I don't think the prosecution proved she was guilty beyond reasonable doubt. And that's the important thing. It has to be beyond reasonable doubt. If there's any reason to suspect she's innocent, then you've got to say it. And it can't be proven that she's guilty beyond all doubt. There has to be enough evidence to go, she did it, lock her up and throw away the key. And I don't think there is enough for that, especially when you read this. But very conveniently, all this stuff is left out. So Michael told the Guardian that he was deeply troubled by the case, and then this is a speech from him. With regard to the medical evidence, I don't think the prosecution proved she was guilty beyond reasonable doubt. I don't think she had a fair trial because no medical expert witness was called for the defence to challenge the prosecution expert medical evidence. So why? You have to ask. The insulin poisoning verdict. Right. So the prosecution alleged there were two principal ways in which Letby inflicted harm: insulin poisoning and injecting air into the babies to cause a fatal air embolism. Letby was found guilty of sabotaging two babies by giving them synthetic insulin, causing them to suffer dangerously low blood sugar levels, hypoglycemia. So, hypoglycemia is a common low blood sugar case, or condition in diabetics. They get low blood sugar, they have to take their insulin tablets, and it brings them back up. That's why they inject themselves with insulin. Though it can also have the opposite effect, which we will look at here. The insulin cases were the first on which the jury reached a verdict of attempted murder, and they were unanimous. Both babies survived. So, like, was it attempted murder? How do you know? Maybe she thought she was doing the right thing. Obviously, they weren't trained correctly. Like, yeah, I don't get this now. Like, insulin is given to diabetics when they have low blood sugar, which is hypoglycemia. But if you give it in the wrong circumstance, it can also cause, like, if you give insulin to someone who's not suffering with hypoglycemia, and there's other conditions associated with the babies that I don't quite understand, but it can also cause hypoglycemia when you administer insulin in the wrong circumstance. Right, so I'm just going to read it out for you exactly right now. So, just to make it more accurate. So it says here, insulin causes hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, when there's a surplus of insulin in the body, either due to taking too much, taking the wrong type, or having a delayed or missed meal. This happens because insulin helps absorb glucose, sugar, from the bloodstream, and too much insulin can cause the blood sugar to drop too low. Um, Excess insulin, when you take more insulin than your body needs to control blood sugar, or if you have a sudden unexpected drop in glucose utilization, it can lead to hypoglycemia. Timing of insulin and meals. If you inject insulin too early or too late in relation to your meal, or if you miss a meal, your blood sugar might drop too low before your body has time to process the food and raise your blood sugar. Other factors: increased physical activity, alcohol consumption, and certain medical conditions can also increase the risk of hypoglycemia when combined with insulin use. Hypoglycemia can cause a variety of symptoms, including sweating, dizziness, hunger, blurred vision, and even confusion or loss of consciousness, very commonly associated with diabetics. There's the treatment. If you suspect you have hypoglycemia, you should consume a quick source of carbohydrates like glucose tablets, fruit juice, or sugary candy. Candy. It's an American study by the NIH, National Institute of Health. Um, So yeah, get something sugary, fruit juice, sugary candy to raise your blood sugar levels. In severe cases, glucagon injections might be needed, according to the Cleveland Clinic. Yeah, so the hormone insulin lowers blood sugar levels, glucose, when blood sugar is too high. If you have type 1 or type 2 diabetes and need insulin to control your blood sugar, taking more insulin than you need can cause your blood sugar level to drop too low and result in hypoglycemia. There you are. I think that's a pretty detailed account. Um, so administering it at the wrong time can cause hypoglycemia. So it lowers blood sugar levels. So she obviously she thought that it was right to administer it, and it obviously wasn't. But both babies survived. Judge Goss directed the jury that if they concluded that Letby had deliberately harmed babies one way, they could also conclude that she had inflicted deliberate harm on others, even if jurors were not certain of her methods. So it's like she's done one bad thing, she must have done another. You know, it's very badly laid out. You know, so and if a judge tells you that, you're going to say, yeah, all right, so she must have done this, right? No, like the method of murder. So you can conclude if she's injected them with insulin to try and kill them, she must have also injected them with the air to cause an air embolism. Like bullshit. That doesn't hold up to scrutiny as far as I can see. Have a bit of glucose myself. So yeah, like just to give a side note, I have a friend in college who had diabetes, and he said if he started getting dizzy or he knew himself because he was checking his blood. You know when you give yourself a pinprick to check your blood sugar levels. He had to do that to make sure that they were all right. And if he was going low and he started getting dizzy or nauseous, he'd have a bottle of Coke or something because it would spike his glucose. You know, because if his blood sugar was too low, hypoglycemia, you want to bring that blood sugar up. You're taking your insulin, which means that it can actually be absorbed by the body. It can't be absorbed by the body when you're diabetic. You know, that's why type 2 diabetics form. You know, and you have a high sugar diet and a lack of activity. So if you're moving around and you're consuming lots of carbohydrates, your body needs them because you're using them. But if you're not, they're just sitting around and your body stops producing insulin. It's a powerful hormone. You know, it's like steroids. Your body stops producing testosterone when you're bombarding it full of testosterone because it doesn't need anymore. You know, the body's a wonderful thing, but it can only do so much. So the jurors were not certain of the methods coming back to this. Yet the judge had said, we'll just go back to it again so you can see. Judge Goss. So you can conclude that she must have harmed them another way if she harmed them one way. So if she injected them with insulin, synthetic insulin, she must have also introduced an air embolism, which is not factually correct. And yet they're being led to believe that. And if I'm a juror, I'm listening to a judge because I assume, well, they know best. Of course you would. You know, it's a judge. So the prosecution presented two test results, the only empirical scientific evidence in the case. An expert witness in court who, when approached by the Guardian, said he could not comment. I wonder why. He said the test results indicated that a steady flow of synthetic insulin had been administered. A steady, nice flow. Biochemists testified in court that the lab had conducted, sorry, that biochemists testified in court that the lab that conducted them was accurate and working well. So basically, our methods are working correctly and our tests are good. That's what we're saying. Okay. But while the test results have provided a helpful clinical guide for diagnosing hypoglycemia, the type of test used does not measure insulin itself. So if you can't measure insulin levels, how the fuck can you say they were too high or too low? You can't. Instead, it measures antibodies to insulin and can cross react with other molecules. So it can react. There are false positives in this case. So the biochemist said that this test was running smoothly. We'll just go back to it. A steady flow of synthetic insulin, but you can't confirm that because it can also react with other chemicals and molecules. All right, so you're saying it here. They're saying that she injected them with synthetic insulin as a means of killing them. This is attempted murder now, remember. The biochemists have said that the lab conducted them was accurate and working well. But while the test results have provided a helpful clinical guide for diagnosing hypoglycemia, the type of test used does not measure insulin itself. Instead, it measures antibodies to insulin and can cross react with other molecules. So that's not that's not holding up to scrutiny at all, as far as I can see. Several experts challenged the use of results from this type of immunoassay test as evidence of crime, including the forensic scientist Professor Alan Wayne Jones, who is Europe's foremost expert on toxicology and insulin. He has written about the limitations of immunoassay tests in criminal convictions and said they needed to be verified by a more specific analytical method to provide binding evidence in criminal cases. The defense never asked the biochemists whether the test was the right kind to prove insulin poisoning. Pretty bad. This and what people felt were fundamental errors in interpreting the insulin results were raised in the detailed papers submitted to the Court of Appeal by a group of experts, including a consultant neonatologist, a medico-legal expert, a chemical process engineer, and a former public health director. Their intervention was rejected as inadmissible and not considered by the court. Come on. So you have a forensic scientist, and not only that, Europe's foremost expert on toxicology and insulin. That's a bit of a weird thing to be I guess insulin as a method of poisoning. So this fella's credentials definitely add up. Sorry, my eyes are hurting. I might just pause that for a second. Just getting a bit of a headache. So I had to just go for a walk. I was getting a bit of a headache, a bit hypoglycemic myself. But yeah, like looking at this and looking at Professor Alan Wayne Jones, like he has said it himself. Do you know what I mean? More specific analytical tests need to be done to provide binding evidence. And you've got other people here as well saying, why are the experts who could exonerate Lucy Letby, why are they not being allowed to testify? Their interventions rejected and inadmissible. Why? There's plenty of good arguments there, and there's grounds for it. Like I'll read through the list of experts again. So apart from a forensic scientist and Europe's foremost expert on toxicology and insulin, which was the hormone said to be used to poison these these prenatal kids, children. Why the fuck was that not allowed in court? Inadmissible. And then you also have a neonatologist, someone who is an expert in premature babies, deaths. You have a medico-legal, so like when it comes to lawsuits, medical lawsuits, this would be a legal expert in medical crimes, I would imagine, chemical process engineer, and a former public health director. So, a director in how hospitals are run, someone who knows how many people you need to have at any given time, how many consultants, how often they should be on the ward, how well people should be trained, because it's a public health director. These are all really good key witnesses and experts. Well, not witnesses, but they'd be experts, to give evidence. All of their interventions were rejected and considered inadmissible, including Dr. Shoo Lee, a man whose paper, I'll say again, was used to convict Lucy Letby. And he was talking about arterial pulmonary embolisms, not venous, you know. And yet, the air embolism, we had our good pal Debbie Evans again. The lead expert witness called by the prosecution was Evans. He left clinical practice in 2009, but has more than 3 decades' experience working in the courts and became a consultant pediatrician in his early career. He helped establish a specialist neonatal unit in Swansea in 1980s. Letby's counsel, Ben Moyers, applied to have Evans evidence. That's not an easy one to say. Evans evidence. So Ben Moyers, Lucy Letby's counsel, applied to have Dewi Evans's evidence dismissed. Among his arguments were that Evans had failed to be impartial, which I said already. He clearly was, biased in the whole thing. So Evans failed to be impartial, and that he had constructed theories designed to support the charges. So he's really adamant on getting convictions. That seems to be his thing. He wants to convict people, and he dismisses any claims of innocence. He always seems to want to convict people, which I would say shows a clear bias, and therefore he's not impartial. So his evidence should be dismissed. And he constructed theories designed to support the charges. The trial judge and the Court of Appeals judges strongly rejected the criticisms, ruling that Evans did not lack impartiality and was well qualified to give an opinion. Yet they dismissed opinions of 4 proper witnesses who could all vouch for Lucy Letby. And now they're not actually vouching for her. What they're saying is, in all likelihood, in their expert opinion, they've all said that the evidence given is incorrect, and yet their arguments are just dismissed. But yet this man, who clearly has a bias and wants to convict people and has boasted about how many people he's had convicted, given his evidence, so he's obviously proud of it, that he's helped supposed criminals get locked up, but he obviously has a bias at getting the conviction. He doesn't seem to care what the evidence shows. He wants to prove they're guilty despite the evidence. Okay. So the judge, the trial judge, and the Court of Appeal judges strongly rejected the criticisms, ruling that Evans did not lack impartiality and was well qualified to give an opinion. They agreed it was for the jury to assess the quality of his evidence. Well, let's see what that was. Evans strongly rejected any suggestion he was biased, and he said, one's role as a witness is to consider all possible scenarios, he said, and then to advise the court based on one's own experience and other supporting evidence, which the other experts were going to do, but of course they weren't allowed. Evans's analysis concluded that 7 babies had been harmed by injecting air into them, causing or contributing to their collapse and death. In some cases, he said injecting air to cause dangerous air embolism was the sole mechanism of murder. In others, he gave additional causes of harm, such as deliberate trauma to the liver or deliberate overfeeding. So which is it, Like, he said an air embolism was the sole mechanism of murder. But then there's other harm to the liver or deliberate overfeeding. And overfeeding, and then you inject with the insulin, would be another method of murder. There were 2 parts to his reasoning on air embolism. His opinion was that babies had either had air injected into their stomachs via the tiny feeding tube that newborns often have inserted through the nose, or into their bloodstream through various lines and catheters. Other prosecution expert witnesses largely agreed with Evans's opinion on this, but the idea that injecting air into the stomach via a nasogastric tube, so naso, nose, gastric into the stomach, nasogastric tube could collapse, leading to death, was described as nonsensical or rubbish, ridiculous, implausible, and fantastical by 8 separate expert clinicians who spoke to The Guardian, 7 of them specialising in neonatology. So they've all gone, he's talking shite, he's talking out his arse. So, like, into the vein, yeah, but through a feeding tube, it sounds unbelievable, doesn't it? And they all agree. And they're experts, I'm not. And neither are the people who write this paper, but they're interviewing experts. And, you know, 7 of them specialize in neonatology, 8 of them are experts and clinicians. And they say it's ridiculous, implausible, fantastical, and rubbish. Nonsensical, also. So Dowie Evans clearly is biased and wants to convict Lucy Letby. Several said it was not practically feasible. Nasogastric tubes are tiny. It would take several refills using the 10 ml syringes on neonatal units to inject a significant quantity of air. Exactly, you'd have to deliver a significant amount, and refilling the thing, pumping air, then back, and it's not feasible. And there are easier ways. Like, I mean, I can't believe I'm saying it, but there's easier ways of killing a child if you wanted to. So, like, why the fuck would they do that? And more to the point, if someone has to keep refilling the syringes, someone is bound to notice, you would think, wouldn't you? So if that was being done and someone has to keep coming back and doing that, surely someone is going to see that. And yet it's all circumstantial evidence. So this case is absolutely rotten to the core. So several expert clinicians, as we're saying here, said that it was not practically feasible. Nasogastric tubes are tiny. It would take several refills using the 10 ml syringes on neonatal units to inject a significant quantity of air. So it would cause damage, but not enough. So you'd have to keep doing it, and it wouldn't be feasible. Furthermore, it would leak out, or the baby would just burp or vomit it up or pass it as wind, so they'd fart it out. They said, right? Evans said it was a phenomenon I had never encountered previously. So he's using his expert witness status to say this, and yeah, he's never seen it before. So he can't talk to it if he's never seen it before. He's not an expert in it if it hasn't been done. He added that without the full clinical records, others could not comment objectively. Very convenient that you seem to be able to. The other half of Evans's opinions on air embolism was that air was injected into babies' veins to cause harm. This opinion was accepted as a cause or contributory. It's a lot of contributory factor by the jury in 5 murder verdicts. In some cases, the prosecution said babies had been harmed by both methods. Very messy, isn't it? Like, you think it should be more clear cut than this, and that's why there is enough grounds, in my opinion, for a retrial. Evans's view drew on skin discolorations observed in several of the babies, and this was the big one. The skin discoloration was the reason you could say there was air embolisms, because it's one of the symptoms of an air embolism. So Evans's view drew on skin discoloration observed in several of the babies, and he referenced the 1989 academic paper by Dr. Shoo Lee and Tanswell on air embolism in the bloodstream in babies. The paper described skin discoloration that indicated air embolism in babies caused by high pressure ventilation. Quite different circumstances to allegedly injecting air at normal pressure. A second expert witness, Dr. Sandy Bowen, we're going to say Bowen, reached similar conclusions. The surviving author of the paper, Dr. Shoo Lee, who retired recently from a career as one of Canada's top neonatologists, was not called by the defence the first trial, but he did give expert testimony in Letby's appeal in April. Lee said that in his view, none of the descriptions of the baby's skin discolorations used by the prosecution witnesses matched the kind that characterized air embolism. So it's not characteristic of air embolism, unlike what Dowie Evans is saying. Lee's testimony was not admissible by the Court of Appeal, with the judges saying the defence could have called him in the trial. The judges added that the prosecution's expert witnesses did not solely rely on skin discoloration to indicate the condition. I have to say, even more dodgy. We've seen that already. See if there's anything new that they could add. Yeah, have a look through that now and see if we can find anything. Right, so yeah, we already saw that graph, but you look here, Sir David Davis. Interesting names, aren't they? And then interesting sentences. He's an MP, member of Parliament. Used parliamentary privilege to tell the House of Commons in May about the 13,000 word article in the New Yorker magazine about the Lucy Letby trial, which raised enormous concerns about both the logic and the competence of the statistical evidence. The US publication reported that British media were also hearing from experts but could not cover while the retrial was pending. Key plank of the prosecution was that it was always Letby who was there when the babies collapsed or died unexpectedly. But as we've discussed there, so we'll go through it again. I've already seen the table, so you can look at that if you want. Jury was shown a chart listing 25 deaths and collapses Letby was charged with, and the names of the nurses who had worked on the unit for the period of the cluster of deaths. Column for Letby was marked with a cross for every incident, whereas the other nurses had only been on shift for a few of them. However, the jury was not told about 6 other deaths in the period of which Letby was not charged. They were omitted from the table. So there we are. And now we get into the really interesting stuff. So the medical director of that unit that Lucy Letby worked on, Dr. Stephen Breary, had originally pointed out a statistical coincidence to hospital management, whose response had been that it was merely just that, a coincidence. One of the most senior consultant paediatricians in the hospital, Dr. John Gibbs, had similar doubts when colleagues at the time were pointing to blame Letby. So all the blame was being pointed at Lucy Letby at this time. A leaked email shows that he wrote to fellow clinicians in early July 2016 and said, the increase in neonatal mortality that we have experienced over the last 18 months might be within expected statistical variance, but I'm not sure because my statistics is not that good, or it's not good enough. You might feel that this must be wrong, but it's all to do with the statistics of small numbers. So even he feels that, and he's the most senior consultant, you know. So Gibbs, who was a witness, sorry, we'll get down there. It's drawn of Lucy there. Gibbs, who was a witness of fact in both trials, has accepted foul play. All right, so he did accept. When approached by the Guardian, he said he could not discuss the case in detail, but added that the concern was not only based on the shift chart, but also on the unexpected and unusual nature of many of the deaths. Okay. In September 2022, the Royal Statistical Society warned that murder accusations in healthcare settings had repeatedly been based on fallacious use of statistics. Its chief executive at the time, Stian Westlake, said some RSS members saw the Letby case as one that could repeat the mistakes of the past. John O'Quigley, good Irish name, a professor of statistical science at the University College of London, said, people get the wrong end of the stick with statistics. In my opinion, there was nothing out of the ordinary statistically in the spike in deaths, and all the shift charts show is that Letby was on duty. Sorry, let me read that again. In my opinion, there was nothing out of the ordinary statistically in the spike in deaths, And all the shift chart shows is that when Letby was on duty, Letby was on duty. Okay. Richard Gill, who I have something saved on him. Here it is. Actually, I was going to show you. Um, it's the Lucia De Berk case, which she was exonerated in. It's very related to this, but here we go. Richard Gill, uh, an emeritus professor of mathematics at Leiden University in the Netherlands, where I've got family, was involved in two cases similar to Letby's in which statistical coincidence was wrongly used in part to convict two nurses of murdering their patients. Lucia De Berk, a neonatal nurse in the Netherlands, and Daniela Pugliali in Italia. Their convictions were eventually quashed, thanks in part to Gill's contributions, because he's an actual statistician. Seems like Dewi Evans he's a doctor. He's not a statistician though. Don't know why he's being allowed to give so much statistical evidence. Gill, who was drawn much criticism for pointedly posting on social media during the trial that the Letby shift table was meaningless and that she had suffered a miscarriage of justice, said the police investigation and Crown prosecution made all the mistakes the RSS warned us about. Nobody studied the statistics in a professional way. Um, the police said that it was not appropriate to comment when further investigations were continuing. The CPS said two juries and four appeal court judges had reviewed the evidence against Letby. The Court of Appeal rejected her argument that expert prosecution evidence was flawed, the spokesperson had said. So he seems to be biased in the other direction, I have to say. Richard Gill seems to be more like, oh, they're innocent, and then Dewi Evans seems to be more like they're guilty, you know. So they're not very impartial, I have to say. It's not great. Right, so let's look. Could there be other explanations for the deaths? Well, let's have a look. In autumn of 2016, after the Royal College report, Dr. Jane Hawdon, the lead consultant neonatologist at the Royal Free Hospital in London, looked at the cluster of deaths and collapses. Her review did not look at all the clinical notes, but leaked documents seen by The Guardian suggested that in 13 of the cases Hawdon reviewed, she found the babies had received suboptimal care and the death collapse is explained um, is explained but may have been prevented with different care. Thought there should have been a comment there, but in four of the cases, the death collapse was unexplained and she advised a deeper forensic review. The Guardian understands that another consultant neonatologist did then review the cases that were unexplained. Evans said her findings differed from his. She declined to comment. Yeah, the Countess of Cheshire said it was unable to comment while other investigations and an inquiry were going on, were still continuing. Okay. Mike Hall, the expert for the defence, said that in his view, the prosecution witnesses exaggerated how well arguably all the babies who sadly died were. Again, it's all very badly worded, but like what they're saying there is they the prosecution's witnesses seem to say that the babies were doing well, when in actual fact they weren't. They weren't doing well. So it was a lie to say that they were all fit and healthy before Lucy Letby intervened, as they say. A point denied by Evans. So he's saying that no, we never said that they were all doing well. Um, but they obviously did. They all said the babies were doing well until Letby got her hands on them and killed them. Hall questioned the plausibility of air embolism and said six of the seven babies found to have been murdered had post-mortems at Alder Hospital, a centre of excellence. These pathologists had had the advantage of physically examining the babies and reported no unnatural findings. Like, come on. So the pathologists who have examined the dead babies said there's nothing unnatural about these deaths. So you've got experts saying that it would have been impossible for Letby, or next to impossible for Letby to actually kill someone the way that Dewi Evans had said. And then you've got pathologists saying that there's no unnatural causes here. You have a forensic expert saying that the testing for the accusation of insulin poisoning was complete bollocks, and the antibody that was being tested for could have been produced with another molecule or number of other molecules, not just insulin. Right? So it's all bollocks. It didn't measure insulin at all. It's not specific for insulin, so you need further testing. You know, it's complete bullshit. Like I remember doing tests in college, and you have a presumptive test and you have a confirmatory test. The presumptive test, like say a Kastle-Meyer test for the presence of hemoglobin, so that's what it tests for, the iron in blood. But that you can get false positives for that because it's not a confirmatory test, it's a presumptive test for blood. You have to do further analysis, like DNA analysis, for example, genetic sequencing, DNA sequencing. It's not enough to just say, oh, it turned pink, the phenolphthalein indicator, your hydrogen peroxide. You put that onto your cotton swab, and if you get a nice shiny pink color, well, then you can say we believe there is blood here, but we can't say for sure. You've also got a leukomolecular green test, which will give a nice green color. And then you've got luminol reagent, which is a glow in the dark. It's really cool. It's a light blue, um, glowing color. It's a luminous blue, but you have to turn off the lights so it can glow. And it's really cool, but it's only presumptive. So it might indicate, yes, there's potential blood here, but further analysis is needed. And it feels like they skipped that step with the insulin testing. By not using a test that is insulin specific, it just produces an antibody that is produced in the presence of insulin, but other molecules could have caused it. I would have thought there'd be a lot more in depth analysis than this, but they seem to be ignoring so many different key witnesses or potential key witnesses. So, anyway, the pathologist said they found no unnatural findings having examined the dead children, dead babies. Dewi Evans said the defence could have called expert witnesses to challenge his and others' opinion in court, but they did not. The defence team declined to comment. Maybe they didn't do their job. Maybe Dewi Evans is right on this. Maybe they didn't defend her well enough at all. Let's see how much more is left. Yeah, okay, we go back and we'll read through it. Many of those who spoke to the Guardian felt strongly about their concerns, but few knew where to take them. So they were like, I'm concerned, but where the fuck do I go? It is understood that several complaints focusing on the evidence given in the trial have been put into medical regulator, the General Medical Council, by some who wanted to have their concerns recorded. Dr. Svelena Dimitrova, an NHS consultant neonatologist who was part of the government-appointed Ockenden review investigating deaths and harm allegedly caused to dozens of babies in Nottingham University NHS Hospital Trust, is one of five who the Guardian understands has approached the GMC in relation to evidence given by Evans. Evidence given by Evans. She said she took this step having been approached by multiple consultant neonatologists and paediatricians and specialist neonatal nurses who flagged up their concerns to her but were frightened to go public. Yeah, for fear of going against the narrative, because everybody's saying she's guilty, and then anyone who disagrees with that will be shunned, and shamed. She said that in her opinion, Dr. Dimitrova, or Dimitrova, I think that's how it sounds Eastern European anyway, and it could be Dimitrova. So she said, in her opinion, the theories proposed in court were not plausible and the prosecution was full of medical inaccuracies. I wasn't there, so I can't say Letby was innocent, but I can see no proof of guilt. There you go. come on. So Dr. Dimitrova goes on to say there are fundamental flaws in the justice system when it comes to prosecuting healthcare professionals, which mean that it does not address systemic NHS failures and blames individuals instead. The information presented to court was flawed and not proof of guilt beyond doubt, she added. And I completely agree with her on that. There is not enough evidence there beyond reasonable doubt. Not even to tip the scales, even. Like, if she got an inadequate defense team, then you could say, well, or yeah, they might not have called expert witnesses, but they obviously didn't do their job. Therefore, she deserves a retrial. And you've got this woman, Dr. Svalina Dimitrova, an NHS consultant neonatologist, again, another expert. Like, how many experts do you need? There's certainly not enough evidence beyond reasonable doubt. She has said it. We've got Roger Norwich, a medico-legal expert with an interest in paediatrics and newborns, has also made a complaint to the GMC. He has put in a complaint about Dewi Evans and has also put in a complaint about the second witness, Bowen. He said he thought both had failed to provide balanced, impartial views, instead giving the court opinions that would not be supported by most doctors. So there you are. Now, if most doctors don't support it, then it's not necessarily expert opinion. It's just an opinion, you know what I mean? Not based in reality. That's why you have peer supported work. People will review your stuff, like peer reviewed, sorry. People will question the accuracy of your findings in your paper when you're doing research. But they just seem to take Dewi Evans' word for it and Dr. Bowen and ignore everything else. Both Dr. Dimitrova and Norwich said they had not received a response to their complaints from the GMC. Anyone can make a complaint to the GMC if they have concerns about a doctor, but most are not investigated by the regulator. Neither Dimitrova nor Norwich had full access to the clinical notes. Bowen responded to the issues raised. Everyone is entitled to their opinion, yet not everyone had access to all the information in the case. I did, and this informed my reports and subsequent opinions. Right, so they're obviously arguing that, well, you didn't get the full report. I did, therefore I know more than you do. But then the argument could be, why didn't other experts get access? Why couldn't they review it? Will be my argument. Evans said he had never been told of any medical inaccuracies and was not aware of the GMC complaints until he was contacted by The Guardian. He described them as vexatious in an article in the Sunday Times. He told The Guardian, my opinion was based on evidence. If they have not seen the original documents, their opinion is based on opinion. Okay. He added, it is understandable that a trial of this sensitivity will create conflicts of views. Wanting to shoot the messenger is not an unsurprising response, especially given the criminal justice system's record of miscarriages of justice. Like Gill, Richard Gill, Professor John Ashton, a former public health director, became exercised about Letby's trial before it was finished. He had blown the whistle on a cluster of baby and maternal deaths at the Morecambe Bay hospitals when he was regional director of public health for the northwest of England. His direct experience with the Morecambe Bay scandal is the human instinct drives more people to look for someone or something to blame, but the root causes are often more complicated and numerous. Yeah, that's the thing, they want to put a face to the case, rather than blaming the whole institution. It's easier to take down one person. And on this, yeah, right. So John Ashton again, he blew the whistle on the Morecambe Bay scandal. So he obviously wants to do the right thing. But John Ashton went on to say, you don't need a serial killer to account for what happened at Chester. Disasters, and this was a disaster, generally happens as a result of convergence of a number of factors. We're talking in Chester about system failure. It was a hospital that was not well run, that had ambitions beyond its capability, that had problems with clinical governance and environmental problems. He added, the arguments about Lucy Letby herself boil down to the fact that circumstantial evidence and statistical and expert witness evidence that I believe was seriously flawed were presented in court. Exactly. Like you got it right there. Everything was flawed. They want to blame somebody rather than admit that the system itself is flawed, because that would lead to a lot of other serious evils going on. Negligence, but people obviously covering it up, and they've obviously just thrown her under the bus. Lots of nurses came to her defense and said that they didn't believe she did it, but we're not hearing about that, are we? I want to go into Richard Gill to show that if you think that the justice system all over the place is always perfect, this is the case in the Netherlands with Lucia De Berk. So we'll have a look now. So Lucia De Berk stood trial for serial murder in 2003, and statistician Richard Gill from the Leiden University was aware of this, but he saw no reason to stick his nose into it. De Berk was a paediatric nurse at Juliana Children's Hospital in The Hague. 2001, after a baby died while she was on duty, a colleague told superiors that De Berk had been present at a suspiciously high number of deaths and resuscitations. Hospital staff immediately informed the police. When investigations re-examined records from De Berk's shifts, they found 10 suspicious incidents. 3 other hospitals where De Berk previously worked added another 10. The probability of such a pattern happening by chance was 1 in a billion, the police said. Again, statistical evidence being used incorrectly. De Berk was arrested on the 13th of December 2001. Ironic. So was I, just not 2001, but the 13th of December. Suspected of murdering 5 children. I might add that I didn't murder children. I was drunk and disorderly, and it was in the Netherlands. Oh, good times. She was suspected of murdering 5 children on the 13th of December 2001. Newspapers called her a murder nurse and an angel of death. Gill, Richard Gill, then working as a statistics professor at Leiden University, remembers his wife telling him about a witch trial and saying, they're using statistics, you should get involved, do something useful. A wife telling her husband to do something useful, where have we heard that? But Gill knew the statistician working on the case and considered him a decent, careful person. So I thought I didn't have to, said Richard Gill. And anyway, I was obsessed with quantum mechanics, he says. In 2003, De Berk was found guilty of 4 murders, 3 attempted murders, and sentenced to life in prison. An appeals court convicted her again in 2004. The Dutch Supreme Court upheld the conviction 2 years later. It wasn't until late 2006, when Gill read 2 whistleblowers' account of the trial, that he started to look into the case and became incandescent. Tunnel vision, bad statistics, and poor human intuitions about coincidence had marred the investigation. When Gill ran the numbers himself, he found the string of deaths on De Berk's watch might well have been entirely due to coincidence. Along with fellow statisticians, whistleblowers, and others, Gill campaigned for a retrial that eventually led to De Berk's exoneration in 2010. She was found innocent. Her case is now considered one of the worst miscarriages of justice in the Netherlands. It also opened a new chapter in Gill's professional life. He became a leading expert on the statistics on medical murder cases similar to De Berk's, and a loud, persistent voice warning of the shoddy statistics that are sometimes central to prosecutors' arguments. In a normal murder case, you actually have a body which has clearly been murdered, he says. When there's only a suspicious cluster of deaths, investigators may assume a murderer is at work and selectively focus on evidence that supports that assumption. People's intuition of an impossible coincidence joins the dots in the evidence. So you're making an inference, but it's not true. So Gill worked with defence lawyers and campaigned in vain to overturn the conviction of British nurse Ben Green, or Ben Geen, Yeah, British nurse Ben Keane found guilty in 2006 of two murders and 15 counts of grievous bodily harm. He also helped secure the October 2021 acquittal of nurse Daniela Poggiali, accused of two murders in a high-profile case in Italy. By now, the misuse of statistics has drawn enough attention that prosecutors sometimes insist their evidence is not statistical, Gill says, but often hidden statistics seep into the cracks. Right. So here we get to this case. So 2021, a year before the Lucy Letby case. In a report peer-reviewed and distributed by the Royal Statistical Society (RSS) in September 2022, Gill and colleagues detailed the statistical missteps in past medical murder trials and made recommendations for how legal systems can do better. Gill hopes the report will help with the case of another British nurse, Lucy Letby, who is now on trial for the alleged murder of 7 babies and attempted murder of 10 more in the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital. And this is a direct quote by Richard Gill. In a normal murder case, you actually have a body which has clearly been murdered. Yeah, exactly. It's not clear cut. All right, so this just goes back into Richard Gill's life, which, okay, right, so this goes on. Yeah, there's far too. You can look into this if you want. I think we've gone enough into statistics, haven't we? Let's just have a little look. Right, so let's have a look. Actually, a murderous nurse at work or just coincidence? Cognitive biases can easily lead an investigation astray and have drastic effects on how suspicious a cluster of deaths seems. In this imaginary example drawn from real-world errors, a doctor reports that many deaths seem to occur while Nurse X is on duty. Nurse Ratchet. The hospital launches an investigation re-examining deaths at Nurse X's ward over the past 2 years. A simple statistical test compares the rate of suspicious deaths when Nurse X is on duty with the rate when she is off. So, are more deaths occurring when she's on duty and are less occurring when she's off duty, essentially? Then calculates the probability of seeing this pattern purely as a result of random chance. The outcome depends greatly on the type of investigation. Right, so we'll look at biased, severely biased, and less biased. Let's have a look now. We're not going to read through all that shite there, but we'll have a look here. So it can show how if you want statistics to work in your favor, you can do it in either way, right? So that turquoise sort of tail color shows deaths with nurse X on duty, and then grey shows other deaths. So you can see there's no deaths when nurse X is not on duty. But we read into this. Investigators look at deaths on nurse X's shifts and found 9 that were medically unexpected. So it was unexpected medical deaths. They judged that 2 more deaths should be added. One that occurred 15 minutes after her shift ended, and another that a pathologist did not consider unexpected at the time, but now finds suspicious, knowing Nurse X was present. So she wasn't present for one 15 minutes after her shift ended, but it's then been added. And then one was not considered unexpected at the time, but now, knowing that she was present, it's considered suspicious. So you see how you can kind of base it. And this is the same thing, right? So we look at this. This is the highly biased one, severely biased. So 11 versus 0, meaning that 11 deaths occurred while she was on duty, no deaths occurred while she was off duty. And the probability of that happening is 1 in 83 million. Okay. And a 2 year period that was looked over. You can see it's in months, so 24 months. Yeah, yeah, 2 years. So the less biased one, investigators re-examine all deaths over the past 2 years, not just those on Nurse X's shifts, finding five unexpected deaths when she was not present. The patterns look less suspicious now. Yeah, because it's almost half the deaths that occurred when she wasn't on duty. You know what I mean? Which, definitely makes her look less guilty. So we look here in grey, five deaths occurred when she wasn't on duty, 11 occurred while she was. Okay. So this is less biased, still slightly biased because we're going from severely biased to less. And then you see how the probability goes way, way down. It's 1 in 10,400. Just have a look. And then blinded. Everyone's eyes are just ripped out. Investigators re examined deaths without knowing which nurse was on duty. So they don't know, they haven't a clue, right? They do not assign to Nurse X the death that occurred after her shift ended and do not reclassify the death considered normal at the time. So, the way one was considered abnormal given that she was on duty, they've now just said it's normal. It's expected. Um, and they haven't added in the death when she had finished her shift 15 minutes previously. So then two deaths are removed. That means it's nine. And we see here that it's 9 versus 6. The probability has again, it's halved, over half, 1 in 488, right? So, yeah. So, do you see how that happens? It's dropped significantly from 1 in 10,400. Sorry, I was going for 1,400. I misread it. She's half. No, it's dropped significantly more than half. I was looking at the statistics wrong. So yeah, it's not even being divided by 10. It's way, way down. I thought that was 1,400 for a second. I missed the zero. My eyes are getting tired. Jesus, like that, it's gone down to 1 in 488. Look at this now. So even if it was at 1,400, you know, it's been divided by 10. Now it's even lower than that. Way, way down. Investigators re examined deaths. Oh, yeah. Already read through that. Okay. Reading through statistics really just gives you that headache, doesn't it? Never mind what I said there. So here's careful examination. So much more detailed. So you see, you have actual times here. So researchers look for other factors that could explain the pattern, such as changes in hospital policy. Now we're really getting into the nitty gritty. They find that Nurse X often worked the morning shift when hospitalized patients are known to die more often than at the other times of the day. Nurse X's deaths now look even less suspicious. Right, so she's working the morning shift. So we're looking at the AM period. And remember, turquoise is her deaths. So she works from, yeah, 7 to 2 p.m. versus 2 a.m. to 4 p.m. 2 a.m. to 4 p.m. are when more deaths are likely to occur. So now we have 1 in 45, which is definitely not suspicious. Yeah, 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That happened while she was on. And then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, and 6 still. But given the fact that when she was actually working, it looks even less suspicious. It's I know it's hard to follow, but you can see how you can manipulate statistics to suit your narrative. by either being very, very specific or not being specific enough. And I feel in the Lucy Letby trial, they chose to ignore some really key facts. Okay. Okay, well, we'll leave that then. Yeah, we'll leave that. And I want to show you another case, Sally Clark. There she is. Um, and I want to just show you. This was a terrible case now. A terrible miscarriage of justice. I have a feeling that the Lucy Letby case will be even more of a miscarriage of justice. In case you didn't know, Sally Clark was a solicitor. She had two sons that both died of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, cot death as it's also known. And Roy Meadows, a paediatrician, gave statistical analysis on this trial, which he wasn't qualified to give. That said, one death, yeah, can be explained by, just cot death, but two, the likelihood of that occurring from natural causes is he gave some mad statistical figure that he wasn't qualified to give, and that was enough to convict her. But Roy Meadows was not a statistician; he was a paediatrician. So, had you said that he was an expert witness, when shown an injury on a child, he could have said, "Yeah, I have seen this. This is not a common injury that I would see naturally." So, like, say if a baby bumped its arm against the cot, just say for argument's sake, but you might say, "Oh yeah, I've seen this. This is quite common because infants tend to, knock against things." Say, for instance, or you might say that's not very common. For ligature marks to be on the baby's neck, you would say somebody has choked that poor child. That would be something Roy Meadows would be qualified to speak on, not statistics. And here's where the problem lies. And as a result of this, you'll see how dangerous it was. So Sally Clark, the solicitor wrongly convicted of murdering her two baby sons, was found dead by her family at her home yesterday. And this is back in 2003, this case occurred. Mrs. Clark, 42, who served 3 years of a life sentence after being found guilty of smothering 11-week-old Christopher in 1996 and shaking 8-week-old Harry to death 2 years later, died during the night, said Sue Stapley, a spokeswoman for the family. No cause of death was given. Mrs. Clark's family said in a statement, sadly, she was never fully recovered from the effects of this appalling miscarriage of justice. Sally was a loving and talented wife, mother, daughter, and friend. Miss Stapley said she was not suffering from any kind of disease at the time of her death, but she was not in the best of health. She said the matter was in the hands of the coroner. Angela Cannings, 42, who served 18 months in prison after being wrongly convicted of killing two of her babies, said, I'm so angry. This lady suffered so much. Now she's dead. I'm just shocked and stunned. She had found it increasingly difficult to accept what had happened to her. She was very vulnerable. John Batt, a solicitor and writer who was a member of Mrs. Clark's defence team and wrote a book about her ordeal, Stolen Innocence, said last night that she had never gotten over the deaths of her children. I spoke to her this week. She would have good days and bad days, but I don't think you ever can ever. You can. Mm. So John Batt, the solicitor, he said, I spoke to Sally this week. She would have good days and bad days, but I don't think you ever can ever recover from something like that. Again, poorly worded, but Imagine being in jail where everyone thinks you are the scum of the earth, the lowest human being that walks the earth. The thick end of it is that she lost 5 to 6 years of her life in what was state-sponsored torture. Cheshire again. Fuck's sake. It's really getting a mention here. Mrs. Clark, who was originally from Wilmslow, Cheshire, before moving to Chelmsford in Essex, had been convicted at Chester Crown Court in 1999. Yeah, so she moved from Cheshire to Chelmsford in Essex. Um, been convicted at Chester Crown Court in 1999. When Christopher died in 1996, experts assumed it had been because of respiratory problems. 2 years later, she found Harry dead, slumped with his head forward. And here we go now. Professor Sir Roy Meadow, the controversial paediatrician, an expert witness at the trial, told the jury that the chance of two children in an affluent family suffering cot death was 1 in 73 million. The Royal Statistical Society disagreed and wrote to the Lord Chancellor saying there was no statistical basis for the figure. That's what they all said. It was like, how the fuck did you pull that figure out of your arse or something? Um, like, what is that? And he's a pediatrician, not a statistician. He isn't qualified to give that evidence, which they have called out. Experts now believe the risk could be anywhere between 1 in 100 and 1 in 8,500. A lot different to 1 in 73 million, isn't it? But that was used to convict her, the poor woman. In 2002, the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which reviews potential miscarriages of justice, referred to the case back to the appeal court after it emerged there was clear evidence of a Staphylococcus aureus infection that had spread as far as Harry's cerebral spinal fluid. Staph aureus, like that's a common cold, you know what I mean? But the children were vulnerable. Um, there was genetic testing was carried out, and it found that they had a susceptibility to these infections, which we'll discuss now. 2002, the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which reviews potential miscarriages of justice, referred to the case back to the appeal court after it emerged there was clear evidence of Staphylococcus aureus infection that had spread as far as Harry's cerebral spinal fluid. Mrs. Clark was released in January 2003 after three judges quashed her convictions in the Court of Appeal in London. She had always maintained that her children had died of cot death syndrome, or sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, as it's also known. The court had been told by Mrs. Clark's QC that they believed there was no evidence of infection. In fact, it appeared that the evidence had been known to the prosecution pathologist, Alan Williams, but not to other medical witnesses, police, or lawyers since February 1998. At the time of her release, she said, "Today is not a victory. We are not victorious. There are no winners here. We have all lost out." Last night, Mrs. Canning said she and her family had also struggled to cope after she was freed from prison. Okay, so this is a statement from Mrs. Canning's. When I was first released in December 2003, we went back to Salisbury. Salisbury, yeah, am I getting that right? I know Shrewsbury, Salisbury, Salisbury, and none of the authorities, social services, police, doctors involved before I went into prison, nobody came to see us. We came to Cornwall in April 2004 and we had to go to the authorities for help. Nobody came to us. This is where I get angry for us as a family and the Clarks. It's almost, oh, well, she's free. Go home go home to your husband and you'll be fine. It's so wrong. So what she's saying there is she's pissed off about what happened to her, rightly so, and she sympathizes with the Clarks. It's almost, oh well, she's free. Go home to your husband, you'll be fine. That's it. Bye bye now, you're free. So be grateful that you're free, even though you were never guilty in the first place. You should be grateful for that. Really. In December 2005, Alan Williams was struck off the list of Home Office pathologists. Professor Meadow, now retired, was struck off by the GMC in July 2005, but reinstated by the Court of Appeal last October. It backed a High Court ruling that he was not guilty of serious professional misconduct. Really? I think he should have been. His evidence had also helped to convict Angela Cannings and Donna Anthony in cot death cases, but were also freed on appeal. So he's done this to two other women, and nothing happened to him. Fuck's sake. Unbelievable. So we look at the timeline. December 1996, Sally Clark's son, Christopher, aged 11 weeks, is found dead while her husband is out. January 1998, her second son, Harry, dies, aged 8 weeks. February, so literally a month later, 1998, Mrs. Clark is arrested. October 1999, Mrs. Clark's trial begins at Chester Crown Court. Professor Roy Meadow appears as a witness, telling the jury there is only a 1 in 73 million chance of two children dying from cot deaths in an affluent family. November, so another month later, 1999, Mrs. Clark is found guilty and given two life sentences. October 2000, first appeal fails. January 2003, Mrs. Clark's conviction quashed by the Court of Appeal. Thrown out, basically. June 2005, Professor Meadow appears before the GMC in relation to his evidence and Mrs. Clark's trial. August of the same year, Professor Meadow lodges an appeal in the High Court against the decision by the GMC to strike him off. January 2006, Professor Meadow launches his High Court challenge. February of the same year, Professor Meadow wins his appeal against being struck off. March 2007, Sally Clark dies. God rest her soul, poor woman. Oh, right, so that's that then. Yeah, so that just shows you miscarriages of justice happen a lot more frequently than we'd like to believe. And Lucy Letby, that trial is not clear cut. The evidence given is not clear cut, and I feel like there's a lot going on. And as you've seen there, you have Lucia De Berk, you have what's her name again? The Italian one, Donna Patoli. Let me get the name again. Um, just gonna look it up there. Hmm. So good yeah, Daniela Poggiali and Lucia De Berk. So you have quite a significant miscarriage of justice in both cases. Sally Clark's thing, her case was completely wrong, and her life was ruined. She apparently she drank a lot afterwards to cope with the trauma. I mean, who could blame her? And obviously, she never got over it. So your heart has to go out to her. But if Lucy Letby is found innocent, this is the greatest miscarriage of justice in the British criminal system. You know, the British courts are, you know, guilty as fuck. They haven't looked at a lot of evidence. They haven't listened to expert witnesses, except for the ones that would convict Lucy Letby. And you could say, you know, her team should have submitted evidence. They should have called expert witnesses. They had plenty of time and they didn't do it. That's not her fault. That's up to her team to do it. You know, and if they haven't done it, then she needs a retrial. And I certainly think there's grounds for it. Let me know your thoughts, guys. This has been an interesting case, and yeah, I want something I wanted to touch on. You know, a lot of statistics. I know it's very hard to follow, and I'm struggling here. So I think it's a good place to end. But it's not as smooth as we'd like to think, and both the court system and obviously the medical system is flawed, and I think there's plenty of doctors that would throw people under the bus to save their own arses. You like to think of medical professionals looking after yourself and sorry, looking after you and have our best interests at heart. We don't want to believe that they could be evil, but they could. There's plenty of motivation for them to throw somebody else under the bus. It's between you and me. It's going to be me that stays on. You're going to fucking jail. I'm not taking the fall for this. You can take the fall. And if you don't believe me, look at Harold Shipman, the real angel of death. He was arrogant. He got away with so much because of his arrogance. And he said, "Oh, I'm a doctor here," So he basically shut down nurses who questioned what he was doing. He was like, "Don't question me. I'm the doctor. You're just a nurse." He was arrogant. He had no bedside manner. You can go into that case. I'm not going to go into it now. We've gone through enough, but shit happens. He was an evil fucker and he was a medical professional. People's lives were in his hands and he took their lives. You know, it does happen. You don't want to believe it happens, but it definitely fucking happens. And we'd like to believe the justice system is fair and just and non-biased, but it's not. Miscarriages of justice happen all the time, unfortunately, all over the place. You know. So let me know your thoughts. It's an interesting case, but an innocent woman could be convicted here based on very shoddy evidence, and that'll be one of the greatest miscarriages of justice of all time. So felt I had to touch on it. Let me know your thoughts, guys, and we'll leave it on that note.